Kenny thinks I have a speech prepared, although I was only asked 5 minutes ago if I would do this presentation. So I see familiar faces and some new faces and some that are familiar that I don't remember the names. But anyway, it's great to see everybody, and it's great to have Kenny back here. I first met Kenny, I'm trying to think of something awful to say or something really funny. But even though we laughed a lot over the years, we really didn't meet until he got into the newspaper work, and I was the editor of the paper, and we transitioned over to all the 3, 4, how many other papers that were going on at the time, and Kenny was instrumental in that transition, and he's done nothing but reward us all since. I'd like to personally say a couple things here. Well, it's all personal to me. What Kenny's written about is really important to me personally. I think that a number of you I know were involved in many of the things that Kenny was involved in and writes about, but there's a part of our history that is positive. We often hear stuff about the negative parts of our histories. I'm talking mostly about the 60s and 70s here. But Kenny has incorporated a lot of the positives. The love that was there, the joy, the incredible intelligence, the conversations that we had. I often joke about having conversations for 4 days with people coming and going and talking about how the world started with, I guess I shouldn't say that it's a video, but anyway, it ended in the same thing. And the players, and so many of them have gone on and left us, unfortunately, but we still have a history, and I thank Kenny for keeping that alive. We need that, and he's added to it by his own skills and ability and good-natured senses. I also do want to say that Kenny, I just found out, and that's what's written here because my little inside source, Scott, has told me that you were recently nominated for the Prose Awards, and which annually recognize the very best in professional and scholarly publishing by bringing attention to distinguished books, journals, and electronic content in over 40 categories. So congratulations. They're judged by peer publishers, librarians, and medical professionals since 1976. The Prose Awards are extraordinary for their breadth and depth, which is amazing. Each year, publishers and authors are recognized at the annual conference in Washington, D.C. for their commitment to pioneering works of research and for contributing to the conception, production, and design of landmark works in their fields. So that's fabulous. And one more thing on the old folks here. I'm older than Kenny, but I have younger kids who aren't young anymore, and you all may have, and grandchildren and everything else. But part of that history to me was, whether you like Obama or not, the fact that we had an African American president, a black president, get elected a number of years ago was an amazing thing. And I was walking in the Congressional Cemetery, dog walking park, with my kid, and he said, "Mom, we couldn't have done that if you all hadn't done all that you did." So, and that was just a piece of it. So I think there's a part of our next generation that knows what we did, and you've kept that alive, and I think that you'll keep that alive for a lot of years, because you can read your stuff. It's not like, oh my God, another book, so thank you for that, and many more books to come.
Thanks so much. Maggie Hackett, one of the pioneers of the left in the Lansing area, and also one of the, has to be a good friend, only my best friends get to call me Kenny. So, that's fine. But so thanks, Maggie, and thanks everybody for showing up. It's great seeing y'all again. I've seen a number of you here for 2 or more times actually. This is the 4th talk that I'm giving on my Voices from the Underground series. The first 3 of them were next door at Everybody Reads. So today we just changed the venue and brought it over to Avenue Café. So thanks for Avenue Café for hosting this event, and thanks to the Peace Education Center for sponsoring this event. You guys are incredible. I can't believe you guys are still around after this many years. Definitely.
Still need a lot of education about peace around here.
There you go. Well, I went to my first Peace Education Center event. It had to be over 40 years ago. I can't remember what it was. I'm sure it was a meeting of some kind. An organizational meeting or a seminar or conference, but I know it was fun. It was educational. Teaching, there you go. But it was great. And also thanks to the cafe here, Avenue Café, for providing a real nice food spread. Always nice to begin an event with good food. So who remembers the potluck dinners from the 70s here? Okay, everyone would bring a dish to pass. We'd feast all night, we'd party, we'd dance, we'd sing, and we organized against the war. There's no way we were going to lose. It was just having too much fun. So tonight, this is a really special evening tonight. First of all, this is the fourth talk that I'm giving, like I said. The fourth book. But this is the last talk. That's what really kind of makes it special. It was a 25-year project. Hard to believe that, but 25 years from when I conceptualized the first edition to the time when volume 4 of the second edition actually appeared. 25 years. So it's hard to believe that. But tonight's a special evening for another reason also, because later on tonight I'm going to be introducing Scott Harris, a man who has brought this community a special gift, a real special gift. And so we're here to pay tribute to Scott, and I hope some of you will join Scott and me up here later on when we get to that point in the evening. So volume 4, Stop the Presses, I Want to Get Off, is the name of it. This is Joe Grant's story of how he came to publish Prisoner's Digest International, or Penal Digest International as it was called originally, the premier, the most important prisoners' rights underground newspaper of the Vietnam era, and quite possibly of all time. It was an amazing paper, and it was my incredible good fortune to be Joe's editor. Anybody here believe in predestination? Anybody? Beschert, as we say in Yiddish. Beschert, it was meant to be. I didn't used to believe in it, but since I started editing the series, I've come to believe that there may be some truth to the whole predestination thing. I don't know, sometimes I think that somewhere between day 6 and day 7, God looked down at me and he said, he's going to cover the underground press. I just always seem to be at the right place at the right time. Certainly that was the story of how I met Joe and the Penal Digest folks. And it began with a woman. I know it's a little embarrassed to say that. It's a cliche, it's corny, but there's no other way to say it. I broke up with a woman. I fell into my woe is me state of mind. And I did what I always did in the early 70s when I was depressed or restless. I hit the road. I went first to Madison, Wisconsin, which was the Midwest radical hotbed of the period. And then from there I went to Boulder, Colorado, which was the home at the time of my all-time oldest friend who was going to school out there. I traveled via my usual mode of transportation, my thumb. And so on this particular day I was hitching west on I-80 from Madison to Boulder, and I got let off in Iowa City. Before I had time to recharge my thumb, a car pulled over. 2 guys were sitting in the front seat. The guy sitting shotgun rolled down the window, and he called out, "Where are you headed?" I said, "Boulder." He said, "You hungry?" Well, I was, but I didn't give hunger a lot of thought in those days. I fed off the exhilaration of being on the road, of traveling whichever way the wind blew, of waving the shopping bag that revealed my destination so seductively while always giving direct eye contact that drivers in oncoming cars had no choice but to either pull over and give me a ride or else pass me up anyhow. But if they passed me up, they knew that I knew that they knew that I was standing there. And so they felt guilty. And that was kind of a consolation prize. You get a little, get a ride or you invoke guilt, one way or the other. So, and if none of that worked to satisfy my hunger, I always had a bag of raisins with me. It lasted forever, it never went bad, didn't cost a lot, and you could stuff it into any pocket of air in your backpack. Anyhow, the guy sitting shotgun opened up the back door. I hopped in, and they drove me to 505 South Lucas, which was their home and their office. On the way to 505, as they called it, they explained to me that they were ex-cons and that they worked on a paper called Penal Digest International.
Is that Colorado or
This was in Iowa City. I was midway between, okay. So, and they worked on a paper called Penal Digest International, or PDI. I never heard of Penal Digest International because it wasn't a member of Underground Press Syndicate, the first nationwide network of underground papers, including Joint Issue, the paper that I worked on here in Lansing. But I certainly was intrigued by a paper put out by ex-cons and whose reporters covered their respective beats in Folsom, and San Quentin, and Attica, and Leavenworth, and other papers, other jails and prisons around the country. They spoke excitedly about the newspaper, but they became even more passionate when they told me about the birth of the newest member of their collective, a little girl who had been born in an in-home ceremony just a month before, in a ceremony that featured music in the background and a hash pipe circulating around the room in the foreground. I was treated warmly by everybody at 505, and I enjoyed a delicious vegetarian dinner. While I was waiting for dinner to be served, I noticed a light table in the back room. I figured that was the office, so I went over to take a look. A partially laid out page was on the light table, so I began to read it just to get a preview of the upcoming issue. Wouldn't you know it, I discovered a typographical error. Well, being the compulsive, anal retentive that I was back then, and Emily's laughing, and am still, okay, I had no choice but to correct it. Fortunately, there was a desk next to the light table, and there was a typewriter on the desk, and there was a piece of paper in the typewriter. So I typed over the word correctly, and then I cut it out with the scissors, trimming away as much of the white space around the letters as I could. Then I picked up the correctly spelled word with the tweezers, lightly dabbed the back of it with glue stick, and then carefully laid it over the incorrectly spelled word, using the light that streamed in through the back of the page from the light table to help me line it up accurately with the other words on that line. And that was it. I felt a whole lot better. The rest of the evening was great because I had that taken care of. I can't remember if I spent the night there or if they drove me back to the freeway. I can't remember right away, but I know that the whole experience left a major impression on me. I wrote a letter back to the Joint Issue folks and they published it. 16 years later, I was beginning to conceptualize the first edition of Voices from the Underground. And I knew that I wanted Penal Digest to be one of the stories. Fortunately, the Special Collections Library here at Michigan State had copies of Penal Digest. And the General Library upstairs had an impressive phone book collection. I think it was one of the largest in the country back then, and it included Iowa City. So I perused a number of back issues, compiled a list of names, complete names, not just first names or nicknames or pseudonyms or aliases. And then I looked them up in the phone book, hoping to find a match. Fortunately, I found one. So I called her up, and I asked her if she'd been part of Penal Digest International in the early 70s. When she said she had, I began to explain the project that I was working on. I said what I was looking for was an insider, somebody who had been a key person on the paper, who could put together a comprehensive history of the newspaper for an anthology that I was compiling of other histories. To burnish my PDI credentials, I told her about the whole experience of hitchhiking on I-80 and about the two ex-cons and the baby being born in the hash pipe, the whole thing. Unfortunately, she wasn't the right person to write the piece. So I said, who do I need to talk to? She said, you need to talk to Joe Grant. I said, can you give me his phone number? She said, no. But she said, if you give me your phone number, I'll pass it on to Joe and tell him to give you a call. So I mustered up all the excitement I could come up with, and I said, great, thanks so much. But as I hung up the phone, I said to myself, well, you can kiss that one goodbye. Because honestly speaking, how often when people say they're going to call you back, do they really call you back? Well, 2 weeks later, Joe called me back. It turned out that he hadn't been in Iowa City the day that I passed through, but apparently I'd made such an impression on everybody that they told him all about me when they returned. He said, Ken, over the years when we were publishing PDI, lots and lots of people came through town. They ate our food, they drank our booze, they smoked our dope, they spent the night, they partied with us. He said, but of all those people, you were the only one to voluntarily work on the paper without being asked. He said over the years, since then, a number of people had asked him to write his story. And he always said no. But to me, he said yes. It was all because I'd corrected a typo. So there's a lesson for all you anal retentives out there. Put that on your resume. There's a job waiting for you somewhere. But over the next year and a half, Joe and I developed a close working relationship and a strong friendship that actually continues to this day. As he dove into the task of writing his story, and I dove into the task of editing his story. By the time we were done, it was one of the longest two pieces in the book. The book, when it came out, it was a huge book. It was over 600 pages, laid out in an 8.5 by 11 2-column format. Literally the equivalent of 4 books. It really was. And I knew Joe's book his story should have been its own book. It really should have been. So now it is. It's been updated, it's been expanded, and a number of the errors that crept in that first edition have been corrected. And what a story he tells. What an amazing story. Joe was the oldest one of all of the contributors. All the rest of us were in our coming of age years. We're in our 20s, maybe early, middle, late, somewhere along the way, but all of us were in our 20s. Joe's story begins in 1953. Okay, ours began during the 60s and 70s. His begins in 1953 when a lot of us were in preschool, and he was in pre-revolutionary Cuba, serving in the U.S. Navy. One day when he was out on leave, he ran into a group of people who were revolutionaries, and he befriended them. So that's how his story starts. It takes us through the years when he was publishing a rank-and-file labor newspaper, and then it takes us into the mid-60s when he got busted for counterfeiting and got thrown into Leavenworth. Prison during those days was a hellhole, but there was a certain spirit of rebellion in the air. There was a certain segment of society that believed that if we rehabilitated prisoners rather than punishing them, that when they were released from prison, they could return to society as well-adjusted individuals rather than as hardened criminals who were going to end up back in prison. So that was the theory, and that was the practice. They tried to do that. And so there were efforts then to provide vocational classes and to modernize libraries and to expand visiting hours and to improve the quality of health care and food and to recognize religious freedom and to not open mail. Little things like that. But prisoners were picking up on this whole spirit of rebellion that was happening in the streets. And so they were beginning to dissolve the differences that separated them from each other based on race and religion. And they were beginning to unite with prisoners, inmates in other prisons around common causes. So this was the atmosphere that Joe was facing when he began to conceptualize his own ideas for Prisoners Digest International, a paper that had 2 goals, 2 purposes. One was to provide a voice for prisoners that the authorities could not silence, and the other was to create a link between prisoners and the outside world. So the first issue came out in 1971. In the brief history, they did a lot more than just print news stories and poems. In the best tradition of the underground press, they also created the news. Okay, so and then they reported on them. So they prevented the extradition of an Arkansas escapee. They helped to facilitate the release from prison of an Indian boy who had already spent 6 years in prison for a crime he never even committed. They exposed the behavior modification experiments that were being performed illegally on prisoners. And they did this actually by publishing insider stories written by the prisoners who had survived these experiments. They tracked and they reported on the successes and the ongoing challenges of the jailhouse lawyers. And they were outside the walls of Attica, actually, before the massacre, doing their best to prevent the massacre. They were encouraging negotiations. Unfortunately, as we all know, they didn't succeed there, but that was their role as activists. They were out there trying. Joe happens to be a master storyteller. What you get in the book is his story of the first and probably only underground newspaper that ever took place inside Leavenworth. It was published right under the noses of the guards. And Joe, of course, was the instigator behind it. So he instigated it. Years later, he writes about it. He tells about the financing that he received for PDI from Jimmy Hoffa, the legendary Teamster leader. And at another time, he got financing from Playboy magazine. He introduces us to all the characters. There's so many characters that revolved around 505. The community people, the kids. There are lots of kids who play major parts in this story. The ex-cons, as they got out of prison, a lot of the ex-cons came to Iowa City, and they would live with the staff and work on the paper. And then there were the visitors from out of town who came through, including one who I'm sure about every one of you knows, but you're not going to recognize the name. Who remembers Jerry Samuels? Anybody? No hands are going up. What about Napoleon the 14th? Anybody?
They're going to take me away.
They're coming to take me away. Ha ha, he. Oh, that was Jerry Samuels writing under the name of Napoleon the 14th. And he spent time at 505. So there's a story in there all about him. Very funny. He also wrote a couple songs that he gave over to Joe. The lyrics are in the book. So, and then there's one other story. There are a lot of other stories, but there's one in particular. It's a very poignant story. And again, there are a lot of poignant stories in here, but this one is special because it's about Joe's mother, his beloved mother. He really adored her. But in reading this story, this part of the story, which is a tribute to his mother, what you're also going to learn for the first time is how legendary singer Peggy Lee got her name. Really interesting story. You got to read this. This was a story that did not appear in the first edition. We were fighting deadlines to get that done, so Joe, he wanted to tell it, but he didn't have time to tell it. In this version, which we had a little more time to work on, he's got it in there. So it's a really wonderful story about how Peggy Lee got her name. And there's a whole lot more. But the last issue came out in 1974. Naturally, as you might guess, police harassment played its role. But so did just good old-fashioned burnout. I mean, it was a long, pretty hectic period, those 3 years. The prison conditions are a lot worse now, actually, than they were then. A lot worse now. The whole concept of rehabilitation has given way to private, for-profit ownership and punishment as the guiding forces behind the prisons. So it's fortunate that there are some papers now including one of the best, which is Prison Legal News. And the publisher of Prison Legal News, himself an ex-con, is Paul Wright, and he wrote the afterword to the book. So I'm really honored to have his piece in there. The foreword is written by arguably the most famous political prisoner in the world, former Black Panther Mumia Abu-Jamal. Getting in touch with a prisoner on death row is a real logistical challenge that involves patience, persistence, little bit of a little incredible networking, and a little bit of luck, or again maybe Bashert, maybe, who knows. But I did track down Mumia, and I was able to send him a copy of the manuscript. He read the book. He loved the book. Let me just read you what he said, because I'm impressed with it. He said, "It would be sheer understatement for me to praise Joe Grant's prison bio as groundbreaking, moving, or eye-opening. It is all these things, but certainly much more. This is journalism of a kind that never," I'm trying to read it through the dark here, that never made it into the school, into the curriculum of J School. This ain't your grandmama's New York Times. This is the real stuff. Grant gives us all a bird's eye view of how prisons ran during the 60s and 70s, and gives us a glimpse of what might have been before the prison reform movement fell into the hands, the black hole of the corrections industry, and the culture of mass fear emerged. So real nice. And he says a lot more. That's just an excerpt, but he loved the book. Only a few months after Mumia submitted his piece, he was a few months after he submitted, like 2 or 3 months after he submitted, he was released from solitary, from the death row, from prison, death row, for the first time in 29 years. I mean, that's really hard to imagine. 29 years. I really liked to kid that it was because of me that he got out, but seriously speaking, it was only because of a concentrated worldwide movement to free Mumia. He's now in the main, in the general population in a Pennsylvania prison. But the ongoing mistreatment of Mumia really is a testament to his role as a voice for the oppressed. Brilliant. He wrote his master's dissertation while he was in prison, in solitary. I mean, really amazing guy. And so I'd like to end this brief discussion with 2 calls to action. 2 calls to action. And the first one is free Mumia. Okay? And the second one is stop the presses. I want to get off. Not free either, but buy it. Okay? All proceeds tonight are going to Everybody Reads. So we're here to support the bookstore. So I hope you're going to get copies of that. Thank you.